So we have our first question coming from Brent.
Brent Koblish with Cargill. Thanks a lot for the session. Appreciate it. Question for maybe the first two speakers. We heard a lot about, the millions of chemicals we know of, but there's millions more, parts per quadrillion, parts per trillion, et cetera. And the fact that just because we can detect it doesn't mean it's a problem, as you pointed out, Albert Einstein's quote. My question is, where do you see the threshold of toxicological concern coming into play and how that may influence regulatory and safety decisions downstream, realizing that, as we talk about heavy metals, obviously that's not in scope of the TTC, but with regards to a lot of unknown compounds that we will be finding and their structure, I see a direct applicability with determining from risk management, risk assessment decisions, but just curious from your standpoint how you would approach that and whether or not that needs to be a significant avenue by which we take on safety and regulatory affairs.
I'll take a first shot at it, but the TTC approach has been applied, and if you look at, I'm not sure if you're trying to get towards in silico, but modeling is another way. If you know the structure, you could do computerized modeling, but as it was probably obvious, I'm a very strong advocate for at least initial in vitro high throughput screening. And I honestly don't see another choice here when we are dealing with disinfection byproducts, for instance, where the vast majority of the total organic carbon in drinking water, we don't know its identity at all. More than 95% of it, we don't know what it is. And so maybe someone else has a better idea about this, but the high throughput screening that's been done, started under NIH and Tox 21, EPA ToxCast, I think is a good way to prioritize the in vivo work. I also want to make that point. I'm not dismissing in vivo. We still need it. But we have to start somewhere when we have hundreds of millions plus the multiples of byproducts from those hundreds of millions. And I think rapid biological in vitro screening is the only way forward.
And I like if it is truly used as a prioritization method, okay, that's great. But as well as I do, there's going to be regulators that are going to regulate directly off of that in vitro data. When I could put something through that high throughput screening, compounds from broccoli that'll light up the proverbial Christmas tree. What does that mean? What is a false positive? But from a prioritization standpoint, totally agree with you. But I'm just fearing that, we're going to start going to the regulatory approach or start regulating based on that in vitro data. But that's a discussion for another time. I know we've discussed it here at LC.
I could respond real quick.
Sure.
That is the concern here in California. That is the battle that's waging now. But none of the scientists that I know of are saying that we should set a threshold just on the in vitro and regulate against it. But the question back, and maybe for the whole panel, would be, what's the alternative? What is the alternative? What is happening now is if people detect 1 part per quadrillion of anything, people are saying we have to build an engineered system to remove it. It will never work.
But if it's applicable from TTC principles, do we even need to do it?
If you don't know the chemical structure, how do you do TTC?
Well, but, right.
So, I know we have another question, but on there, a lot of times we've been timing it here. We need to do more mass media. I know that there are models with disinfection byproducts where we don't know what the chemicals are, but there are systems that actually generate, like you go into a lab that Shane has, where they generate, this is the thing, you go there, you take the water that comes from there and you test in this in vitro system. You're not one at a time in chemicals, you're looking at overall indicators. And that's another type of thing. And on my talk, I had mixtures. We don't know, epigenetic changes could be different if you add bromate, and we publish papers if you have bromate with 3 or 4 different ones. So we also need to look at how we're testing these models in vitro, not one at a time, but seriously going to the wastewater treatment plants, the disinfection, getting these and then using them and testing those. We might not know what the chemicals are, but the end result is actually going to be the important thing.
Thank you. Allison Yates. Um, In my life, at least, there's a lot of now introduction of PVC pipes in both homes and I assume also in waste treatment plants. What is that? What's on the horizon, or what do we know about it from a microbiological and from a contaminant perspective in terms of health? In other words, is it cleaner, is it better, or do we have other problems that we have to worry about?
The PVC pipes, as are all pipes that are being installed under state supervision or through the plumbing codes, comply with the NSF Standard 61 for health effects, which is migration of chemicals of potential health effects. And so there's risk assessments done on any specific contaminants, whether it's a monomer, a dimer, an additive, a stabilizer, what have you. And so from those standpoints, the PVC pipes or CPVC or whatever the PEX materials might be, those are compliant with the standards, the national standards, as required by law. And from a performance standpoint, there is, it's probably preferable to a lot of the cast iron materials because you don't get that degradation of the iron into the system, which is resulting in a lot of other secondary impacts on drinking water supply. And the one thing I wanted to add is that, and maybe I didn't present, was the water leaving the treatment plants is of compliant nature. It's what it picks up in the distribution system and in the home plumbing system that usually results in the failures that we've seen.
So do you see that as this infrastructure problems that you've identified are corrected, hopefully, it's going to be primarily moving away from metal-type piping to PVC or some other synthetic?
We're seeing a lot of that switch over. I think about half of the distribution system pipe is now of a CPVC or PVC nature, and with the rest being still cast iron, ductile iron, cement coated, etc.
Thank you.
Hi, Chester Rodriguez from Coca-Cola. Thank you for your presentations, very informative. I heard in one presentation that California is going to be the first state to use high throughput, to actually regulate, in the water world. I wonder if you can provide some insights into what the plans are, because as you know, I know in vitro technologies, I think is the way forward, but there are of course many challenges, including what signaling pathway you're going to regulate on. What about metabolism? What about body clearance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So I wonder if you can provide some insight into what you're thinking. Yep.
Well, first, a caveat that this is my personal opinion. However, it's open access information to see that the state has funded work on this topic, numerous expert reports, and they're going to fund more work. That's just been announced recently. And I again want to make sure it's understood when I hope I didn't use the word regulate. They want to use it as a monitoring tool for unknowns. And let me just phrase it as what the Water Board's question was to the expert panel on which I serve. We don't want the next perchlorate. We don't want the next NDMA. We don't want the next 1,4-dioxane, which we find after the people have consumed it, after we've injected it into our groundwater. Analytically, you would not have detected those compounds with the technology available at the time. So the question is more of an occurrence question than a health endpoint question. It is, what tools could we use that can help us get ahead of the curve of identifying new substances that we may not have known about, but also looking at the mixture. And so my prediction is that the state will start with the low-hanging fruit, which is estrogenicity. And this is an endpoint which is widely agreed upon by the OECD, already implemented in parts of the European Union, where you can use an in vitro system to predict the effects in an animal. But again, the question is more of let's monitor the water using a reasonable battery of endpoints. It won't be all-inclusive. It's not going to have behavioral endpoints. There's a lot of things you can't do with those assays. But it's a start. It's a beginning. Because what else are we going to do? We just monitor for the 100 contaminants in the Safe Drinking Water Act? I can tell you the public won't go for it. Because most wastewater in this country right now, you could drink because it is compliant with the Safe Drinking Water Act. 90-some% of the nation's wastewater, if we just follow the Safe Drinking Water Act, we would say, let's just drink it now. So that's the question, how do we get ahead? And if anyone has better ideas of how you do that, and think about the mixture, and think about the unknowns, step forward, because there are expert panels all over the world who would like to hear that, what the other way to do it would be.
Yeah, thank you. I think high throughput, like I said before, I think is a way forward. But, we just need to be careful, promoting the responsible use of it, right? Yeah. Because when when you have an isolated cell and you're exposing that to massive levels of a chemical, you don't have any of the, protein binding, metabolism, blood flow. So that, yeah, I just wanted to make that point that we have to be, careful in the way we use that, those new technologies. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, but I would also say that using a rat and mouse to come up with the regulations we have now, I could show you an equal number of arguments where its metabolism, where its pharmacokinetics, where its stomach does not mimic human, and we make the same mistakes. And it costs a lot more money, takes a lot more time. So there's no perfect solution, I agree. Brent?
I'd just like to continue this debate, if you could. So one of the things that, it's like bait and switch regulation, okay? So we know that, hey, let's just monitor using this. That is a way for the regulatory world to, yeah, I agree with you. Scientists may go, hey, we need to do this so we can prioritize. That's just not how it works, though. The scientists may say that, the policymakers will take that and just start regulating. It will happen. That's why you have to couch, it's more than just the science, it's the communication around this. And from my standpoint, if your point to me earlier about, well, if we don't know the structure, we can't use TTC. Well, if you don't know the structure, how can you regulate something if you have no idea what it is, too? So, you could play that game back and forth. The problem is, is the fact that in vivo and classical toxicology, it really worries me that we're starting to get away from the whole animal model. What other mechanism do we have? In vitro is not better. In fact, it opens up the door for more questions. Yes, true, that metabolism may be different from species to species, and we have these uncertainty factors that we can use, but it's almost like, from a toxicological standpoint, we could talk about this all day long, that we're going backwards, and all of a sudden the fundamental principles of toxicology using in vivo models isn't good anymore, but how is in vitro better? So that's where I'm fail to see your argument that we need to totally utilize this technology to inform us. I agree, to maybe inform and better, prioritize our resources to in vivo modeling. But as well as I do, we don't live in that perfect society. And once the papers start coming out saying this, that, and the other thing, the headlines are going to read, it doesn't matter. The vast amount of public doesn't understand that a cellular model is different than an in vivo model, but that's what the headlines will read, and then the policymakers will start picking up on that and regulating based on in vitro endpoints.
Well, if you're advocating that we bury our head in the sand because we're worried that regulators will take science the wrong way, we will never advance. And what I'm telling you, it will happen, and it's going to happen. The World Health Organization is also going to advocate. We cannot do in vivo testing for everything. It's a prioritization tool. I'm interacting directly with Sacramento. I have not heard one regulator say what you're saying, not one. Nor have I heard one member of the expert panel say what you're saying. You need to read the documents, because we have people that come up and say that stuff without one basis of shred of fact. Give me a citation where any of the expert panels have said it, and then I'll buy it. You're speculating.
No, because if you look at the world just from take science out of it. We know that this happens in other situations. But you're in Sacramento, you also have OEHA there that's regulating on things and these types of things. Where's the problem? You know, you're worried about parts per quadrillion. When we get down, I would advocate that from just a regular toxicological standpoint, you're saying that we need to be worried about parts per quadrillion, parts per
I never
trillion.
said that.
No, I know you never said that,
Thank
but
you.
we're looking at all these levels at parts per quadrillion, and I'm saying in parts per trillion. And do we need to be focused on those?
Yeah, I think the point that you're getting at, Brent, is how do you, the communications of it. So if you find something, and that's another issue. I don't think we can solve that, the communications piece. Let's move on to Chester for the last question.
I thank you. The discussion is really good. I think this is just a comment. Actually, the most promising use of high throughput technologies that I've seen is actually, I know, has to do with clustering chemicals, based on bioactivity profiling, and then using read across. So, with the read across, of course, you're using, tox information, for chemicals that you do know, and then comparing those, the in vitro signatures. And I think that's the most promising use that I've seen. And if you see at the scientific program at this year's, SOT, there's a big emphasis on read across. So that's something to, think about, so we can start thinking about the proper context of these technologies. Thank you.
Just like to maybe finish off about what do we use to monitor. It's like energy. It's not one solution. It's not wind. It's not nuclear. It's going to be a combination of things. And I think with this monitoring thing, it will be a combination. We're not abdicating in vitro over in vivo, at least I am not. But there's different approaches in prioritizing. It's going to be a combination of different things that we'll be able to use, and then trying to standardize those approaches, and the data that's going to come out among these different agencies is going to be just as classical. If you do omic regulation or you do any omics, you're only as good as your algorithm assessing the data, and we need to make sure we standardize that algorithm across as well. So it's a combination of different things combined with standardization of the analysis as well as communication, as mentioned by Dr. Pugh.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, this was certainly a very lively session. I thank you all for your attendance.